Next night, the woman cut great green armfuls of fresh grass from the water meadows and dried it before the fire, so that it smelt like new-mown hay. And she sat at the mouth of the cave and plaited a halter out of horsehide, and she looked at the shoulder of mutton bone, at the big, broad blade bone, and she made a magic. She made the second singing magic in the world. When the woman heard Wild Horse tripping and stumbling on his long mane, she laughed and said, "Here comes the second. Wild thing out of the wild woods, what do you want?" Wild Horse bent his wild head, and the woman slipped the plaited hide halter over it, and Wild Horse breathed on the woman's feet and said, "O my mistress and wife of my master, I will be your servant for the sake of the wonderful grass." "Ah," said the cat, listening, "that is a very foolish horse." And he went back through the wet, wild woods, waving his wild tail and walking by his wild lone. But he never told anybody. If I were to visualize Eden, it might be this. Children at play under a high roof, defying gravity and hard surfaces, where the swallows swoop in from the sunlight to their nests, and everything breathes out and in the gauzy, maternal smell of fresh hay. Security, harmony, freedom, and the warm presence of cattle below in the byre, sharing the space with what has been stored up by people laboring with nature to outlast winter. Time and the seasons subdued. In my childhood, the hay was loose, not in bales, the work of scythes and pitchforks, a lost art now. But the fields of my childhood were tiny 10-acre plots. In the wide prairie spaces of Saskatchewan, the bringing in of the hay, the laying of it up, was a challenge, a craft and a mystery all its own. When you were haying, especially as a young fella, the hay was what you call wild hay. It was just naturally growing on the prairie.
Prairie wool, either lowland wild hay or upland prairie wool. Yeah.
Can you describe that for someone who doesn't know what prairie wool is?
Well, it's real thick, grows real thick, not too high. It really is just almost like wool.
Has it got a lot of nourishment in it?
Yeah, yes, it has. Dry or green. They've done studies on it in the university in Saskatoon. And we finally come to the conclusion, what the old ranchers knew all the way along, that it was, you couldn't get much better feed.
Now, is it true that when that stuff dries naturally at the end of the year, it's still got nourishment in it when it's growing?
They said it loses very little. Yeah. If it freezes dry, if it, you know, you get an early frost, it freezes dry, then it isn't quite as good.
How long did it take to dry?
Not very long, actually. You could pretty well cut it and stack it the next day.
So what were the varieties of tame hay that came in first?
Well, usually when they started to grow tame hay, of course, it was all alfalfa.
But what about the crested wheat that's everywhere?
When they introduced that into here, everybody went for it, huh? Because it comes early. In the spring, a really early grass, and but it kind of took over in a lot of places. That was supposed to be the salvation of the drought, you know, to have hay, grass, because it does come early. There's no two ways about it. But once it gets so high, then they won't eat it.
So you had to cut it pretty early?
Yeah, just as it started to come into head. Of course, they have several different varieties of it now. So.
Oh, people are still planting it.
Oh,
I thought it
there's
had just
some,
got
yeah,
away from
yeah,
people.
there's some. Not a lot, but there is some.
So what's your reaction when you hear about these programs paying farmers to put land back to grass?
Well, in some cases, it was certainly the right thing to do, I would think. There's a lot of marginal land that never should have ever been broken up anyway.
So why did it get broken?
Money. I mean, wheat went to high price, and, you know, people farmed it for years, and then they just couldn't make it on a lot of it. You know, they just didn't produce enough. The older ranches, it was survival of the fittest.
I don't know what's in it, but the cows sure like it. They especially start eating it right before they calve.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they really, it's candy, it's sweet. We got quite a bit this year. There was water in the sloughs, and then the heat got us lots, so it just depends. In the condition they're in and in the weather that we're having, we've been feeding them. We've been watching what they clean up in the feeders, but for the most part, it's 4 bales every 2 days. So we'll feed every second morning. And if they're starting to lick right to the bottom, we'll give them 5 bales, and if that wouldn't do, we'd probably give them more. Say hello, mothers.
Hello, mothers.
And they're all wondering if they can get on camera too.
Are you going to put grain to them about now?
Grain, they've wintered so well, it's been such a good winter. If it was a hard, cold winter, we probably would. But our feed quality has been good. You just watch the conditioning of the cows, and as you can see, they're not hurting any. They've had a really easy winter, so.
Do you use it all up in a winter?
Oh, no. No, we usually have 1 year of supply on hand.
And that's your plan, is it, to
Yeah,
do that?
yeah. In this country, sometimes the rain will shut off for more than 1 year, and if you don't have it, you're out buying it, and then if you're buying it, probably everyone else is, and the price is usually quite a bit more than what it would have cost you to make it, so. You cut these ones, I'll cut these ones, okay? I think my knife might be sharper than yours.
Well, how long can you keep a bale without it deteriorating?
3 years is max. And even then, they say that vitamin A, D, and E is, as the bale gets older, they lose some vitamins. So we just top our cows off in the fall with A, D, and E shot. And
I've heard it called candy. Tanya called it candy. Alec Howard spoke of it as candy. Is that all it is? Just a filler that they like?
well, it's more than a filler, because in the short grass country, it still has a lot of vitamins and nutrients in it, as long as it's put up properly. Cut it high, let it cure good, and yeah, they'll clean it, the feeder right out, and leave alfalfa till about this time of year, and then they start backing off on the slough hay, and then you just start going with a little bit more grain.
How many years are the sloughs good on average? Can you count on them?
It depends on runoff. Like this year, the slough hay will be way less than it was last year. So you can't count on it, but I mean, it's also a grazing option. But our cows used to live on slough hay and grain alone. And never used to have alfalfa.
Doris, this land, is most of it never been broken?
Oh, very high percentages of it has not been broken, for sure, of all this land. And I guess more so when you get up into the hills, there's less of that.
Oh yeah, less.
That has been broken. And it's a good feeling to have that native prairie, because, you know, you go to other areas and there's really not that much of it. That native prairie is such an amazing thing, with when you consider all those grasses that are in, let's say, a cubic foot of ground, all the different types, and how they kind of you know, they're so compatible. Some mature early, some mature late, like the needle and thread grass and the blue grama.
So what shape was the ground in when you got here?
It was well looked after. Like the prairie grass was exceptionally well looked after.
That was part of the appeal of the place, was it?
And the guy knew us, and he said he wanted us to have it. We wanted it too.
What is involved with having good pasture?
Well, you must graze so as you have probably 50% of your grass left, so as it has enough cover to retain moisture for the next year. Basically, not overgraze.
You're sharing the land with a lot of wildlife too, I guess.
Well, that's for sure. A lot of deer, both whitetail and mule. And there's the odd antelope, not very many here, but meadowlarks and those long-billed ones, what do you call them?
The curlews, the avocets?
Yeah, curlews. A lot of fruginous hawks.
We have the ruby-sided towhee here that comes, and they're so beautiful. Very secretive bird, but very beautiful. Birds are sure singing today. Whatever that means.
There was land down in these parts that should never have been broken, and for years and years they raised crops out of it. How do you feel about people putting grass back? You've done some of that yourself, haven't you?
Well, I think they're on the right track if they leave it into grass or try and get it back into grass.
We actually have neighbors that harvest the prairie grass and are trying to, you know, use that for seed and get it reestablished quicker back to its natural state. He rides the lease through the same hills his great-grandfather rode when he was custodian of grass. Mushrooms grow wild around the salt lick. A moose with a catheter flank wades in swamp among willows where beavers have engineered lodges and dams. 3 great white pelicans lift from the water. He checks his cattle while a lone pronghorn watches from a grassy knoll. A Swainson's hawk's shrill whistle splits the sky as gophers dart down holes and a coyote slinks past the horizon's edge. How long, he wonders, will I ride where cattle and deer graze the same coulees? He knows time can't measure the quick flight of a bird, the sudden dive, a gopher caught in talon's clutch, the flow of water washing over cobblestones. He rides the lease, facing a southeast wind that bends the grass toward him, ever watchful of the sky, for clouds, for signs of rain and the right time to move his cows to the next field. He studies what's happening at the root of things.
Now, when I was in the archives at Medicine Hat, Donnie showed me some photographs that had some kind of, was it an overshot or a...
You're talking about a stacker.
Right.
An overshot stacker, yeah. Yeah.
But they weren't being used by the time you...
A few, but not many. They were in the earlier days. We never did use one. Well, you had the thing what we would call a bucking pole, with a team of horses on each end of it. A big pole with some teeth on it. And the overshot stacker had a thing that came down, poles or timbers that laid on the ground. You came in with a bucking pole and pushed the hay on that. Turned your team around, pulled your bucking pole off. And then there was another bunch of horses that pulled on and tipped the overshot off, and it went over this way, dropped onto the stack.
But that's was pretty unusual in Saskatchewan.
Well, a lot of the barns had slings in them, tracks in them, but most of them, of course, were used for bundles or something. They pitched them out.
And he gave it for his opinion that whoever could make 2 ears of corn or 2 blades of grass to grow upon a spot of ground where only one grew before would deserve better of mankind and do more essential service to his country than the whole race of politicians put together. 200 years ago, Jonathan Swift regarded grass as important as corn, which to an Irishman means wheat. Each ensured survival. But after the first ranches on the Canadian prairies, the homesteaders who came in the early years of the 20th century were forced by government decree and as a condition of ownership to wage war upon grass. They had to break the land. By their time, wheat was the king. Grass must take second place. But of course the grass was here already, part of the natural order that had given sustenance to animals, bison, antelope, deer, and their predators, and through them to people for millennia. Wheat became king. For 2 generations, this was the breadbasket of the world. But things have changed now. Wheat with declining prices and the massive cost, however you may regard this issue, of chemical input, fertilizer, herbicide, pesticide, is no longer king. It scarcely pays its way. And that, in a hungry world, is a bitter irony.
The grassland was destroyed through cultivation. There's a few remnants along the edges. There's a road allowance on one side, so you can take a look at it and you can kind of get the idea what the bulk of it was, you know, from these little bits and pieces that are left. But again, it's been a agriculture field. Cropped one year, summer followed the next year. Soil quality very poor. You know, it's been actually very damaging for the soil, and it's gotten to the point where it just simply, you know, does not make any sense to continue to, you know, try and grow crops on it anymore. There's a lot of areas that are cultivated, and you know, people are now in the process of establishing perennial grasses on again, you know, that probably should have been left alone to begin with, but just weren't.
For years, there was a move to try and put everything into cropping. When prices were up, certainly there was a huge push to convert even some of the marginal lands into crop. We have been reversing that. We've had a number of programs, both federal and provincial, that have provided funding to reseed to either native grasses or to forage crops, and that's been helpful.
I seeded 280 acres, and that was done late last fall. Now, a lot of the types of grasses that do grow here, seed is not widely available, and is not available at a cost that, you know, as a cattle producer, you know, you could afford to use it to seed. A very simplified stand of native grasses would still probably cost at least $60 an acre in seed cost now, which is just not practical for most producers.
We have an environmental farm plan program that is in place. Farmers who have done that environmental study on their land very often have made very sound decisions and have been provided with some financial support to return light lands, at-risk lands, riparian areas to both trees and grass. The other side of that is we want to see increased development in our cattle industry, in our livestock industry as a whole. And in doing that, you want to make sure that you're developing every possible synergy you can, that if you've got an intensive livestock operation, that you're composting or biodigesting your manures, and when you're putting them back on the land, we're making sure that we're doing measurements to see what the impact is, make sure that we don't get land that is toxified by the use of manures as fertilizer.
You know, a common grazing management strategy is for ranchers and cattle producers, is to graze tame pastures earlier in the season when their growth is most rapid and their quality is best, and then save their native pastures for later on in the summer because they continue to grow a little bit later in the year and they maintain their quality better. Cattle look healthier coming off of a moderately grazed native prairie than what they do off of a lot of the tame pastures. And, you know, maybe it could be my native prairie bias, I don't know, but my perception is that they always seem to be in better shape. I don't know how we would fare with a diet of only 1 or 2 foods, you know, and that's essentially what you know, cattle on these tame pastures are dealing with. You know, they're eating one or two plant species, and perhaps maybe a more diverse mix of plant species is in fact healthier for the grazing animals as well.
So this is 200 acres that you seeded last fall.
Yes.
So it's pretty early to see any results.
It's really difficult to see anything right now, yeah. Like I say, hopefully if we were to come back late summer again, we'd see a lot of slender wheatgrass growing, but it would really, it's going to take a few years before this really looks like a grassland again.
Yeah. This really is pretty horrible earth, isn't it?
Oh, it is horrid earth. It is really horrid.
But people have been trying to, half succeeded in growing wheat here
for probably 60, 70 years or so.
Really?
Yeah. Let me take a look here. This is, see all the grass seedlings there? Actually, in this part right here, I'm very pleased with it. You know, if it had all looked like this, I would be extremely happy. All these plants here are the native grasses starting to grow.
This will fill in?
This will fill in, yeah. It will fill in. It looks kind of like a weedy mess right now, but you know there is ground level shelter from the wind a bit, and there is the weeds aren't overly dense, and the grass has got a good start on it.
It's funny to think of this little patch of hope.
Yeah.
And I'd come back in 5 years' time, I guess, and
It should be, yeah. And say within a year, this will be well covered. Seeding native species and getting a plant stand established of native species is still not. It's not a native prairie. It's not restoring a native prairie. A native prairie is something that just simply cannot be restored. And you know they have a special value to them that goes beyond their value as a grazing resource. It carries the remains of cultures that has lived here for 10,000 years. Although I'm sure they had effects on the landscape. They didn't have the same type of effect that we have on the landscape.
Finally, I suppose, finally that is in our human sense of the word, the grass will reclaim the land, cloaking our deeds and misdeeds, stilling our dreams. Perhaps in the wind that stirs the seed heads and tussocks, there'll be a whisper of who we were and what we imagined. Pile the bodies high at Austerlitz and Waterloo, shovel them under and let me work. I am the grass, I cover all. And pile them high at Gettysburg and pile them high at Ypres and Verdun, shovel them under and let me work. 2 years, 10 years, and passengers ask the conductor, what place is this? Where are we now? I am the grass. Let me work.